It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, which is Eric Stover, Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center and Adjunct Professor of Law and Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Professor Stover has built the Human Rights Center into a premier interdisciplinary research and policy center that is highly regarded nationally and internationally. He is a pioneer in utilizing empirical research methods to address emerging issues in human rights and international humanitarian law. Before joining Berkeley in 1996, Professor Stover served as the Executive Director of Physicians for Human Rights and the Director of the Science and Human Rights Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has served on several forensic missions to investigate mass graves as an expert on mission to the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. In the early 1990s, he conducted the first research on the social and medical consequences of landmines in Cambodia and other post-war countries. His research helped launch the international campaign to ban landmines, which received the Nobel Prize in 1997. He has published 6 books, including The Witness, War Crimes and the Promises of Justice in The Hague, and The Breaking of Bodies and Minds, Torture, Psychiatric Abuse, and the Health Professions. He is a member of the editorial boards of the International Journal of Transitional Justice and Human Rights Quarterly, and a board member of the Crimes of War Project. Can we please welcome Professor Stover?
Thanks, Rick. What I would like to do, well, first I want to thank the organizers for bringing my wife and I from Berkeley to beautiful Perth, and we've enjoyed our stay here and especially what we've learned here at the conference. What I'm going to do in my time is to have us take a look at 3 organizations. And these organizations have worked closely with survivors of violence in post-war settings, and they've worked with local organizations in a way to affect change. So in a way, what I want to do from my field, which is an awfully depressing field, frankly, is to at least look at 3 organizations that have been effective and brought about change not only locally where they've worked, but also internationally. And I hope in some way what I say will touch upon both your research and your practice, because there's something I've noted here in the conferences. We seem to have this dichotomy between the domestic jurisdictions and how they operate in the so-called international jurisdictions, and try and show that there are ways in which we can actually work together. And it's not perfect, but it can be done. And what I also want to talk about too is you'll see that in all of my work, and I'm really going back almost 40 years doing this work, is how I constantly see procedural justice theory being repeated over and over. And we know the 3 elements, prime elements of that research. And that is that when you work with survivors and you engage them, when you show them respect and you give them a voice in the proceedings or in the process, they will not only be able to respond better to accepting what might be a judicial process, but also feeling engaged and it affecting their lives. So the 3 organizations that I'm going to look at are the International Commission of Missing Persons in Bosnia, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which is now worldwide, and the Pader Girls Academy in northern Uganda. They're 3 very different organizations dealing with very different topics in post-war settings. What I'd like to do is, as I describe the formation of these organizations, it's their story. I will be somewhat self-referential because I was involved in helping or prompting the establishment some of these organizations. But the story's not about me. It's about the survivors and the families and the organizations that have made this possible. If there's time at the end, I will try to give sort of lessons learned, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So missing persons is going to be the first topic, and we're going to go back to the future. And we're going to go back, and actually personally for me, my first interaction in Argentina was in 1976. It was in March of 1976. I was traveling in Argentina, and I was detained during the military coup. It was only for one night, but I was thrown in a cell with about 12 other young men. Some of them had been tortured, some had been beaten. The next day, we had to spend the night taking care of one another. I had been roughed up, but nothing like they had been. I had an American passport. I was released and expelled from the country. They just didn't like the fact that I was an American who spoke Spanish with a Chilean accent and that I was in this area of the country. But it deeply affected me and sort of affected the direction of my work ever since. So from 1976, for the military coup, for the next 7 years, there was military rule in Argentina in which some 320 concentration camps, detention centers were established throughout the country. Suspected dissidents, subversives were picked up and taken to these centers where they would either be tortured, some were released, but most would be tortured and then eventually taken out and executed. By 1984, finally with the Malvinas War and the Argentine defeat, the military junta was voted out of power. There were finally elections, and a civilian government came to power under Raul Alfonsín. He campaigned under the human rights banner, and he immediately set up a commission on the disappeared, and he also set up to have a tribunal to try the 9 military junta leaders during that period of time. I was known in Argentina, and it was in '84 that I received an invitation from the Commission of the Disappeared with a request that I really knew nothing about, and that was, could I assemble a forensic team to come to Argentina to deal with 2 problems. The first problem was that throughout the country on military installations and cemeteries and near detention centers were the mass graves, unmarked graves, some individual, some mass graves of people who'd been executed during the regime. The second request came from a group called the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. These were grandmothers who were looking for their disappeared grandchildren because their children had been believed to have been killed. Sometimes women who were pregnant when they were abducted were taken to a naval hospital in Buenos Aires and they gave birth. Then they were executed. Those children were given up for illegal adoption. And there were some 300 to 400 children in this situation. So they wanted to have a geneticist come to see if we locate the grandchild and say you have 4 or 3 grandparents, then can we do a genetic connection to that grandchild? So I brought a geneticist, and I put together a forensic team, and we went to Argentina to help in this effort. And I have to say, when I first went, I had met with all the local human rights organizations, and I had to explain to them in a meeting in Spanish, and I'm saying, listen, I'm bringing in a team from the United States. There's no pride in this, because we have a forensic capacity because we are a violent country, and there's a lot of crime. And of course, the U.S. government had played a role in supporting the Argentine military in the early years and so on. So it was also a process of acceptance of having this team. We traveled throughout the country. We came back to Buenos Aires. We saw the sites and called for a moratorium on exhumations because this was the kind of scene that you were seeing. Judges with goodwill were hearing from families and ordering that some of these unmarked graves be exhumed and identified, that the bodies be exhumed. But what was happening was they didn't have the technical capacity to even exhume the graves in a proper way. This is a woman. She was an exile, Argentine woman who was in exile in Mexico who had come back She lost 2 daughters, had disappeared. When this photograph is taken to the right, there's a judge. I'm off to the right listening. And the judge is saying to her, she's a psychologist, you're a scientist, can you identify your daughters? You're tall, could you? And the pain that was, and the extension of the pain that was going to the families through these exhumations that weren't being conducted properly. So with the forensic team that I took there, one member of the team was Clyde Snow, a forensic anthropologist who died at the age of 84 last year. And he and I remained after the team had left, and I said to him one night, would you be willing to continue working in Argentina? And he did, and he dedicated the rest of his life to working on the disappeared. So Dr. Snow and I began first trying to find out forensic scientists in the Argentine community who might be engaged to be trained in the methods to conduct this work. Not by me, but by him and others. And as it turned out, we found 2 things. One is that the forensic scientists during military rule oftentimes were part of the problem. They were signing out no-name graves, ningún nombre, death certificates, or they turned a blind eye. There was still nervousness about the military, so there was no desire to become engaged in this process. We even went to the Department of Archaeology, and some of the leading archaeologists there were still frightened. So who did we go to? The students. And we found a group of 5 students, archaeologists, medical students. Over the process of 8 months, they were trained to carry out the exhumations in this fashion here, so that the remains could be removed in a professional way, a respectful way, and in a manner in which they could later be identified. Just in basics in forensic anthropology, all of us have some 207 bones in our body, and each bone has a story to tell. If you collect that evidence in a way that is done archaeologically, professionally, then you can, through determined stature, time of death, sex, various characteristics, that you can identify the person. For example, if you rebuild the vertebra and you take an X-ray and you compare them, or a good radiologist can make an identification at 99.5%. Also, you'll find fractures, dental X-rays, and so on to help with identification. So this process began in Argentina, and as it took off, of course, the question is, why are we doing this? And there were really 3 reasons. The first was to identify the remains so they would be returned for the families for proper burial. I've continued in this work ever since, and I have never been in a culture or society where the care, the need to identify and bury the missing has not existed across cultures, across religions. The second reason for doing it was to collect evidence for trial, and this would be evidence for the trial of the military junta and any future trials. And third was to establish historical record, because what was being said by the military and their supporters was, in fact, these had been shootouts. This was not execution style. These people were not executed. So what happened within the year, there was a trial, and Dr. Snow and I testified in the trial. And this is Dr. Snow showing the evidence that he had collected in one case of a young woman who had actually had a child while in detention, and was later taken and executed and was buried in an individual grave. About 1.5 years ago, she had the child in the Naval Hospital, and the child survived. She was taken and executed. The child was given up for adoption, and 1.5 years ago, that child was finally found and reunited with her grandmother. So the effort here ended up training this team, the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team. That's Dr. Snow in the center, Clyde Snow, and these are the various members of the team. Last July, this team celebrated its 30th anniversary. It has worked in 50 countries around the world. It worked on the identification of Che Guevara, whose remains were found in southern Bolivia, but it's also worked in Bosnia and Rwanda, and it has gone on to train teams in Chile, in Peru, in Guatemala. And so just simply beginning with these students and having them trained to do this work, and their ability to take it forward. One thing I learned in working with the teams was something that I think maybe, hopefully some of you in your work will have noted before. In my area of public health, there's a theory called social control theory, and it's fairly well accepted now, that people who are in control of their lives have better health outcomes. And it doesn't really matter on social economic levels too. People who are in control of their lives, who can control and manage their lives well, will have better health outcomes. What happened to me when I was observing the exhumation process, and this is one in Argentina, and what you see here is, this is Clyde Snow training Guatemalan students, just like the Argentines, and they're doing an exhumation in a valley in Quiché, which is the center of the country. And if you see in the background, the family members here, mainly the women. And what was interesting when the exhumations were taking place there was that at first the team meets the families. They have the putative site where they believe the grave is. And the families, a little caution between both sides, the team and the families. But what was important was, by the end of the day, and it was always happens, families were coming out with photographs. They're coming over, of course there's police tape around the scene that's being exhumed, but they're interacting with the team. And they're, of course, as the forensic scientists themselves, they're going to go and visit the homes of these people because they want to see, are there hair follicles? Did your daughter have a brush in which there may be hair follicles which hold DNA? Are there any dental x-rays? Let me sit down and talk to you about what fractures or what's the medical history. And so what you started seeing was this interaction between the team and the families. And what I noticed, and others have as well, is that for the families of the missing, they drift into a limbo world of hope and denial. It's so difficult. You'll see it anytime you see a plane crash, or you see. Think of recently in Korea. Think the families, the denial. They can't accept it, and all this time with military rule that they've lived under, they can't go to the police. They cannot go to the authorities for help. But here they're having a scene in which there are, because it's ordered by judges now, it's civilian rule now in Guatemala, is that you're seeing that the judges are there, police are there, they're in their proper role, they're guarding the site. These are not Americans or Europeans or anyone else there doing the exhumations, it's the Guatemalan students themselves. And you start to see a process where the families become engaged. And this is very important and something we didn't necessarily anticipate. But then I want to take you to, the teams are being trained. We go on and work in Iraqi Kurdistan. We ended up working in Rwanda after the genocide there. I did a mass grave survey, which frankly was the worst 4 or 5 weeks of my life. I've never seen anything quite as upsetting as that was. But eventually we were asked to begin investigations in the former Yugoslavia. And if you'll all remember, in 1991, the war breaks out with Yugoslav J&A troops that come into Croatia, and then it spreads into Bosnia, and it will last until the Dayton Accords are signed in December of 1995. So very briefly, in 91, 92, there was a commission established by the UN to investigate any violations of international humanitarian law looking into war crimes. Clyde Snow and I joined the team. We located a grave near Vukovar, which was a town near the border with Serbia. And it was the hospital massacre of some 200 hospital patients. We eventually performed the exhumation there, and what was interesting is the minute we began that work, it created expectations throughout the former Yugoslavia. That families now, and I step back a minute, until Argentina, in most post-war society or situations, most post-violence situations, you do not have exhumations of the missing or the disappeared. People were simply left where they were, or there were collective burials. But this had begun a process. But it also began a process of great expectations on the part of the families. As the war progressed, and Serb forces within Bosnia expanded, they took over a great deal of territory in Bosnia. And the UN forces, the peacekeeping forces that came in, set up safe areas, safe havens. And one of those was Srebrenica. And Srebrenica was formerly a silver mining area, and some 40,000 people, for usual population of around 15,000, were crammed in here for months and barely surviving. These were Bosnian Muslims. Ratko Mladic, you may recognize him, was the general of the Bosnian Serb army. And with his forces surrounding Srebrenica, in early July, actually the 7th of July, it's the 15th anniversary, Serb forces moved into Srebrenica and took over the town. And what happened at that point, and this is the town of Srebrenica, is the troops came in through roads, through the hills here. And what happened when at this point, the Dutch battalion of UN peacekeepers were supposedly guarding the town. But when the Serbs came, they were not instructed to resist the Serbs. They couldn't have. They didn't have the power to do that. However, there could have been airstrikes that would have stopped it. But anyhow, the Serbs came in, and what happened is the women and older men and younger boys and girls fled to a factory in the town, a little place called Poticari, where the Dutch soldiers were, and they gathered there. Meanwhile, the young men realized that they had to leave. They couldn't stay as the women and older men and younger children could. And so they fled. They gathered in a field outside of Srebrenica, and they fled on a trail that became known, the Trail of Life and Death. It had actually been a trail that Bosnian Muslims had used to go to the town of Tuzla, which was a Muslim area, and bring food into the safe area. And when they fled, and they went up into the hills, the Serbs surrounded them, and they were shelled and fired at, and they were brought down into the flatlands, and executed and buried in mass graves. And an estimated 8,000 people disappeared during that period. When we moved in, one of the things we were able to do, so you can see 5th of July, is if you see here, we were able to get satellite imagery, and we were able to see that there, on this farm, here is what would look like a fallow field in this period of time. But then days later, here you see this disturbance. And we were able to start locating these graves and begin a process of exhumation. And the team that was formed to do it would be working for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And so this team was organized and brought into Tuzla and began the work of doing the exhumations throughout this area. It was really tough work. And this is the sorts of scenes that many of the forensic scientists had to deal with over this period of time. But what happened here was the two main accused were going to be Ratko Mladic, the head of the Bosnian Serb army, and Radovan Karadzic, who was the civilian leader of the Serbs at the time. And the court was charging them with 2 international crimes. One was genocide, the other was crimes against humanity. The elements of those crimes are such that you need to prove a special element. For genocide means there was intent to do it. For crimes against humanity, you just need to prove that it's systematic, not just, it's difficult, systematic and it's widespread. What was happening with our team, which is being made up of many of the Latin American members and other people coming in from all forensic scientists from all over the world, was we were spending our time trying to identify all the bodies. But we got a notice from the office of the prosecutor in The Hague saying, you're taking too much time trying to identify these bodies. We don't need all the bodies identified. Show to us that some people are identified in each of these graves, and we can show that it's systematic. The ligatures are the same. We found the same curtains were ripped up and used as ligatures in the various graves and so on. But what was happening is around us were the families, the women and so on, living nearby. And they didn't care about evidence going to The Hague. What they wanted were the remains of their loved ones to be identified and returned. And it was particularly important in Bosnian Muslim culture because women they're the ones who say the prayers for the dead. It's their social role that they have. So ultimately, I always call this our Srebrenica moment. It was a moment in which we all stood back and we said, who are we working for? Are we working for this international court? I don't fault them. This was all a new process for us, or are we working for the families? And fortunately, what happened then at this point was a lot of us actually wrote articles and were very worried that there wasn't going to be identification. The local authorities couldn't identify the bodies. And the women of Srebrenica themselves campaigned for such these identifications. Well, what happened was the formation of the International Commission of Missing Persons. And this took place, Queen Noor of Jordan and President Bill Clinton came together. I think with President Bill Clinton, there was a bit of guilt in the fact that they knew, as The Guardian has just revealed, actually, that they knew, the Americans and the Brits knew, that this Srebrenica was going to happen and there was no movement to stop it. But anyway, put that aside, as this commission was established. And what happened with the commission is that throughout Bosnia, genetic DNA labs were set up. And Bosnians were hired and trained, and Serbs actually joined the teams that would come in to do the identifications. And these labs were established. And why I think this is so important is the fact that here was the possibility of an international intervention that would be working with the families and the survivors, in which they were able to be directly engaged by giving blood samples, because the process is you either have a buccal swab or a blood sample is given from the family member, and then DNA can be extracted from the bone. It's perfected to an incredible ability to extract DNA. And identifications could begin to be made. What also happened was something that, as the commission started doing its work, this was the farm I showed you earlier, was when the Serbs found out that these investigations were about to begin, they dug up some of these graves and they took them into secondary graves. And then a little later there was another panic and they dug and they took them into tertiary graves. That the evidence collected here through DNA could show that one individual in this grave, part of his remains were here in a secondary and also in a tertiary grave. So that you were doing a humanitarian process that also collected evidence that could later be used in court. But what ultimately happened, and I'll finish here on the International Commission of Missing Persons, is as of today, of the 8,000 men and boys who disappeared, nearly 6,930 have been identified through DNA analysis. It's quite remarkable, something we couldn't have done even 10 years earlier in Argentina and Guatemala. The other thing that's happened is the family organizations, because they're not only working at Srebrenica, they're working throughout the country, the Croat Family Association, the Serb Family Association, and the Bosnian, they're collaborating together to work and to exchange information. And you're also seeing a greater engagement of the family members. If you give a blood sample, and many of the Bosnian Muslim women, they're older women who from Sarajevo and that countryside and the countryside there, are now not used to using computers. But now, if you give a blood sample, you can trace that sample through the computer, and they're starting to engage in the process itself. And we're also seeing that because of this engagement, of taking care of their primary needs, that eventually a more favorable attitude towards having prosecutions take place both internationally and nationally. So I'll end there and move quickly to the problem of landmines. And this I'll move fairly quickly through. Landmines became a problem in the 1990s primarily because we had so many interstate and intrastate civil conflicts. And it's also because in the 1950s and 1960s, all of us who remember the fact that we had light plastics made our lives much more comfortable, food could be preserved, but you can also make lighter mines, smaller mines. And these weapons were being used indiscriminately in all of these various conflicts. Some of the mines that exist, and it's estimated that each day, somewhere about 50 or more people are killed or injured by landmines, particularly anti-personnel mines. You have vehicle mines, to stop vehicles, but then you put smaller mines around anti-personnel mines to stop deminers from taking those mines out. These are the really most dangerous ones. But these are the sorts of mines you have. This is a tripwire mine. This is a mine that is called a butterfly mine or a parrot mine. It is dropped from helicopters. The Americans used it really indiscriminately during the Vietnam War, being dropped. And the danger of these mines is that children get fascinated by them and they'll pick them up because they flutter to the ground, and unless they're stepped on, they won't explode. But what you would see in countries like Cambodia, and this is where I first took a mission there with an orthopedic surgeon and a deminer, was the toll that was being taken on victims of landmines. And the reason they're so terrible is that in many developing countries, as we know, the movement has been towards dealing with infectious diseases and not necessarily traumatic injuries. There's been a push by the World Health Organization in that direction, but all of a sudden you're creating in these hospitals a need for trauma surgery. And when somebody steps on a landmine, they have about a 12-hour window before being taken mostly by ox and cart, or if they're lucky on a bicycle, or because in rural areas, to get to the hospital, to have the surgery done, debride the wound. Usually you have to go back 2 or 3 times to have the surgery done properly. Imagine a 10, 11, 12-year-old child who has lost a limb. They're going to have to go through a number of prosthetics throughout their lives. And so these costs are mounting up. So when we went to Cambodia, this was with Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights Watch, we set out to document what was happening. And by doing this, by listening to the survivors. And what we came to realize was that what we needed to do, that this was happening in Afghanistan, this was happening in Nigeria, this was happening around the world, that we needed to create research protocols so that we could go to each of these different countries and interview people and amass information, data about the medical and social and economic consequences. This is another problem that was facing us oftentimes, and we saw it in Cambodia and in Somaliland, was that refugees would be sent back, but the landmines, the fields, had not been marked yet. And so we worked with local doctors, and teams were made to try and document I'm sorry, it's an old slide here, but when there were resurgence of landmine injuries was the same time that was with refugees coming back, and that had to be stopped. What happened was, with this information, there was a movement, an international campaign to ban landmines was established in 1997. And what was remarkable about this campaign was it was very grassroots. Fiat was in the business of making anti-personnel mines, not in its factories in Italy, but in the Middle East. Motorola was involved in making landmines. They're more and more sophisticated. And what was happening as the campaign grew and local groups were joining, workers in the Fiat factory across Italy went on strike until they got the company to stop. So it was this remarkable campaign that was going, spreading throughout. And eventually it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. The reason I raise where I raised the international campaign to ban landmines, is that I don't know what's happened, but we've sort of lost in this media instant age the ability to form campaigns around issues, whether it's climate change. And I always felt this was a model because it wasn't a top-down. It involved a number of organizations across the world working together to document it. Well, eventually in 1997, the campaign ended up with the international treaty to ban landmines, which countries signed on to. Now there are 162 members, countries that are members of it, and it means no production, no distribution, and no use or sale of landmines. Unfortunately, 35 countries have not joined, including the United States. The problem with the United States, although it is investing heavily in demining efforts around the world, is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. They will not, and the Koreans will not give up those landmines. So we still have some major hurdles ahead. In the interest of time, I'm going to go one last topic, and that's child soldiers and child mothers. And this takes us to the problem of child soldiers. We know that there are some, I have to get the figures here, the actual estimates of child soldiers ranges to about 300,000 today. These are soldiers who are recruited below the age of 18. 40% of armed groups or organizations, militaries, use child soldiers around the world. Why does this happen? Well, one of the reasons is an AK-47 is a lot lighter than it was even years ago. Plastics, again, have made these weapons easy to carry. In destabilizing situations, children are easier to recruit. There are also the AIDS epidemic, which created millions and tens of millions of orphans, easier to recruit into your armies. The children follow orders more readily. And so all of a sudden we've had this boom in child soldiers throughout the world. The area I'm going to talk about is northern Uganda, which has been, until recently, in conflict through this area here between, I'm sure you've heard, the Lord's Resistance Army and the Ugandan government. The Lord's Resistance Army was a sort of homegrown rebel group that was established under Joseph Kony, who had taken it into his mind that the Acholi tribal area here, that the Acholi children should be brought into his rebel forces and he would reinvent them into an Acholi nation. And so their children were abducted and taken into his forces, thousands and thousands. And what happened is young girls from the age of 12, 13, and older were often given to commanders as sex slaves or as wives. And what happened was here, we're back in this area in South Sudan across the border were the bases, and then the patrols would go out into the area here. By about 2005, some thousands and thousands of millions, almost 1 million people were in camps, IDP camps, all throughout this area because of the fighting between the LRA. And this is to give you an idea of child soldiers. And what happened when I went there in 2005 was to investigate violations on both sides, the LRA and on the government side. And during that process, as I was going around the country to the different camps, I found out that there were 11 reception centers that had been established throughout northern Uganda. And these reception centers were for child soldiers who had either escaped or had been captured, and they would be brought to these reception centers that were run locally by local organizations. The children would stay there for a month while they tried to find their parents or their family members. Many times they couldn't find them, or it was hard to locate them, or they'd been killed. So you had quite a number of refugees or orphans who were there. And what happened in these camps, they did things like art therapy, and children you'd see when they first came in would draw about the war and what they'd seen. But by the end of they would actually work with them on this, that they'd start drawing their homes again and thinking about possibly returning home. As you would go into the centers, you'd see this, very common. I mean, if you look at her face, you can see somebody she's just had arrived 3 days from having been escaped and highly traumatized. So these children were traumatized, uncertain of the future. Joseph Kony had 60 wives. Some of the other commanders had 14, 15 wives, and then taken in. So there was a great deal of trauma. We worked eventually with the MacArthur Foundation with funding. We went in and we helped the reception centers set up computers and communicate with one another, set up questionnaires. And so when children came in, they would be interviewed. And what was an interesting fact we found, this is not well done, this slide here, but particularly 19 to 30-year-old women, if you see, they were held the longest with the Lord's Resistance Army, confirming the fact that many of them, because they were held back at the bases, were actually being used as sex slaves. These are 4 of Joseph Kony's children in one of the camps. You had many of the women coming out with children. And what was happening was their families, in many cases, were not accepting them back. Because in the culture there, tradition is that you marry into the husband's family. And also, the poverty was so extreme that having another child and your daughter back and your child was often difficult to sustain. So these young girls with children who were coming out were not able to reintegrate into the community. And as I went to the reception centers, you would always be introduced and then talking to the children. I'd ask them one thing, and it was of course a leading question. It wasn't, but I would say, "Who wants to go to school?" Hands would go up, hands would go up. And there was a real sense that their loss of this time, that they wanted to go back to school and be able to engage. But it was difficult. Most families couldn't afford to have their children go to school. They had to work in the fields, and also, particularly the young women with children couldn't go back to school. So what happened is I met a wonderful woman, Alice Khan, in one of the centers in Pader, this one area, and I asked her at one point, if the war ends, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to establish a girls' academy for women who come out who are pregnant or have young children, and they will come to this academy and they will be able to get an education. So eventually with MacArthur Foundation, a group of us conducted an assessment, and we got the MacArthur Foundation to fund the Pader Girls Academy. And as of today, 800 girls and their children have gone through the school. They live at the school in bunks with their children. You can go on a scholastic track, or you can go on a more occupational, vocational track. At the school, they have a bakery. They have a bed and breakfast, and they run a cafe. And this is Alice in the center with the girls, working with some of the girls. And we are now at the point in which we want to go back and do an assessment of what's worked and what hasn't at the academy, with the idea, could this be a model that we could use in other post-war societies, or are there elements of it that could be integrated into secondary schools in post-war settings? So just to sum up and at least have, I think, maybe a few minutes of questions, what I wanted to convey here was, first of all, the power of, when we do this work, of blueprinting. keeping in mind cultural considerations. But the idea of the Argentine team then training a Chilean team, training a Guatemalan team, a Peruvian team, it's spreading, is that you develop programs that you can take elsewhere and this to be effective. The second is when we're dealing with issues that like landmines, and the problem that's common in many countries is to find established survey instruments so we can document in a similar manner in each of those countries. Because the fight in the campaign against landmines wasn't really so much with the politicians, it was with military officials. And military officials seeing a poster of a child who's lost his leg may not be moved necessarily by that. You're going to have to show that these are weapons they're going to have to give up. And so using a research and a systematic approach is important. Also, hopefully with PADER, or how can we take something that has worked, it appears to have worked, and replicate it in other areas. The other message here is in some of these situations is we didn't work ex cathedra. We weren't working with the government per se, or we weren't working with the United Nations. This was working with local organizations together to find answers and to have international input, but working with these organizations. It's people-centric. You aim and you find out, you listen to people. What do they want? What do the families want? What are the needs of landmine victims? What are the needs of these girls? Not a top-down approach, but one in which you take the time to listen and survey and to find out. Another point is you're in it for the long game. You have to remain. Too much of human rights work seems to be coming in and documenting abuses and leaving. And we can't do that. And finally, and I'll end on this, I think, and maybe in the terms of this conference, is that we need to look at people we work with. They are more than victims. They are not just victims. Yes, they suffered, but they have a right to be engaged, and they have a right to be treated with respect, and they have a right to have a voice in the process. And if you work together and you stick with it, you can indeed affect change. Thank you.